You were the only one who stopped. 5 words. That's all it took to break a man who hadn't cried in 20 years. Caldwell had spent his whole life fixing broken things, engines, fences, other people's problems. Nobody ever fixed anything for him. Nobody ever showed up. Not once. Until the morning 500 motorcycles came over the hill and shook the desert floor like thunder from heaven. They were coming to bury him. They weren't. If the story moves you, subscribe. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far one man's kindness can travel. Right? Ethan Caldwell saved a woman's life. He almost didn't stop. Nobody talks about. That's the part that kept him awake for weeks afterward, staring at the ceiling of his small house while the desert wind pushed against the windows. He almost kept driving. His foot hovered over the gas pedal for 1 full second, maybe 2, before something in his chest pulled him back. Call it conscience. Call it instinct. Call it whatever you want. That's stupid at first. It was 11:47 at night. Terrible. He remembered the time because he'd glanced at his dashboard clock just before he saw the tire marks cutting across the pavement. Fresh marks, deep ones. The kind that told a story nobody wanted to read. Headlights swept across the road, and for a brief moment, everything looked normal. Another empty stretch of Arizona highway that goes on so long, you start to wonder if you're actually moving or just sitting still while the world rolls underneath you. He saw them, the marks. What in the world? He muttered to himself, not really asking anyone. He was used to talking to himself. Living alone for 12 years does that to a person. A fat old beagle named Rust had died 2 winters ago, and since then Ethan had gotten into the habit of filling the silence with his own voice, narrating his movements, asking himself questions, answering them too. He slowed the truck. The marks didn't go off the road gradually. They didn't drift or wander. Across 3 lanes with the kind of violence that only happens in 2 situations: a blowout at high speed or a sudden collision with something the driver never saw coming. Pulled his truck to the side, left the engine running, put the headlights on. He climbed out slowly, the way men his age climb out of trucks carefully, her hand on the door frame, feeling the familiar ache in his lower back that had been with him since a shop accident 3 years prior. On the pavement, and listened. Silence, deep, old desert silence, then barely audible, almost swallowed by the wind, a sound, a low, wet sound, like breathing that wasn't quite right. "Hello?" he called out. Nothing answered him, but the sound continued. Below the edge of the road, somewhere down in the darkness where his headlights couldn't reach. He went back to the truck, grabbed his flashlight from behind the seat. The big one, a heavy-duty torch he'd carried for 30 years, and with a beam so strong it could light up a barn from 50 yards. He clicked it on and moved toward the guardrail. He shone the light down into the ditch. Made his stomach drop. A motorcycle, a big one, built for distance and power, now destroyed. On its side, the chrome frame bent at angles that chrome frames are never supposed to bend. The wheel was still spinning, slowly, with a faint whirring sound that seemed almost mournful. Oil had spread across the ground in a dark, glistening pool. Beside the motorcycle, a woman. She was wearing a black leather jacket and dark riding pants. Her helmet had come partially off, not all the way, but enough to make him immediately afraid to move her. She was lying face down, one arm bent beneath her body in a way that made him wince just looking at it. She wasn't moving. Ethan's flashlight hand trembled for just a moment. He steadied himself. "Hey," he said, better than before. "Hey, can you hear me?" She didn't respond. He scrambled down the embankment. It was steeper than it looked. He slipped twice, hit himself on a scrub brush, felt it tear his palm, kept going. When he reached her, he crouched down and put 2 fingers to the side of her neck, below the ear, the way he'd been taught to do 30 years ago as a volunteer with the county search and rescue unit. They're faint, irregular, but there. "Okay," he said himself to her, to the night. "Okay, you're alive. That's the first thing. You're alive." He didn't panic. Long ago, that panic was just fear wearing a suit and pretending to be useful. He'd seen men panic in real emergencies, and he'd seen what it cost them. A breath. He assessed. Helmet partially dislodged. Removed. He would not remove it. Moving it wrong could turn a serious injury into a fatal one. And he knew that. Breathing shallow but present. She was getting air. The arm beneath her visibly wrong. Visibly fractured. Maybe worse. Blood he could see some at the edge of her hairline. Not catastrophic. Not arterial. Not the kind that meant he had minutes. But he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. No signal. He looked at the screen for a moment, stared at that empty signal bar like it personally offended him. The phone back in his pocket. All right, he said. We're doing this ourselves, he thought carefully. Moving an accident victim was dangerous. Every training course he'd ever taken told him that. Leaving her at the bottom of a ditch alone, in the cold, with an irregular heartbeat and possible internal injuries that had its own math. Sometimes the dangerous choice and the necessary choice are the same thing, and you just have to make the call and live with it. He made the call. He spent the next 15 minutes working with methodical care that would have impressed any paramedic who witnessed it. He used his jacket to fashion a crude but functional cervical support, pulling it and positioning it to limit lateral movement of her neck. To her the entire time, steady, calm, even-toned, not because he expected her to hear him, but because he needed to hear himself, needed to maintain his own composure. "Trying to help you," he said, easing his arm beneath her shoulders. "I don't know your name, but I know you need to get to a hospital. I know how to get there, and that's enough for right now." Moving her up the embankment was the hardest physical challenge Ethan Caldwell had faced in decades. Than a small woman, she was solid, clearly someone who spent time on the road, that carried the kind of compact, functional muscle that comes from years of physical living. With a potentially fractured arm and unknown internal injuries, he had to move her in a way that minimized trauma while still covering ground. Moved her in stages, small stages, stopping every few feet to reassess her breathing, to feel for her pulse. The desert dirt got into his boots, into his collar, into the tears in his palm from the scrub brush. He didn't notice any of it. "Stay with me," he told her, not knowing if she could hear a single word. "You're going to stay with me. You understand. I've got places to be tomorrow morning. A customer coming in at 8 for a transmission job. If I don't sleep, I'm not worth a damn. So you're going to make it through tonight. Oh, and so am I. And we're going to be fine." It took him 22 minutes to get her to the truck. He checked the time only once during that effort. When he finally laid her across the back seat, as carefully as he'd ever laid anything in his life, he was breathing hard and shaking with the effort. He stood for a moment with his hands on his knees. He aroused himself. "Okay," he said, "okay." He climbed into the driver's seat. He knew these roads, every curve, every dip, every hazard. He'd driven them in daylight and darkness for 30 years. He knew that the nearest hospital was 34 miles away. There was one stretch of switchbacks he'd have to take slowly regardless of the urgency. Calling for help would be possible, again, about 12 miles out, where the signal from the Tucson towers finally reached into the mountains. He drove the way a man drives when someone's life is in his hands, fast enough to matter, enough to keep her from being jolted. He had one eye on the road and one eye on the rearview mirror, watching her in the back seat, watching for movement, for the stillness that meant something had changed. The sound once, just a soft sound, barely a syllable, quite a word. He wasn't sure what it was, but it told him she was still there. "I hear you," he said immediately. "I'm driving. You're safe. On." 12 miles in, his phone lit up with signal. Called 911 with one hand, while the other stayed on the wheel. Dispatcher was efficient and calm. "Is she breathing?" "Yes." Slow but consistent. Possible fractured arm, visible head laceration, a high-speed spill on a motorcycle off Route 89 near mile marker 147. "How long since the accident?" "I don't know exactly." "There's maybe 40 minutes. Is she conscious?" "No." "One saw sound about 10 minutes ago, but hasn't been responsive." "You're doing the right thing. Keep driving. We'll have a team ready at the ER entrance." "What's your ETA?" 22 minutes, he made it in 19. The emergency bay doors opened before he even got the truck fully stopped. Those nurse and orderlies moved with practiced speed, pulling open the back door. They're reaching in with gloved hands, speaking to each other in the clipped shorthand of people who do this every day. One of the nurses turned to Ethan as they wheeled the woman inside on a gurney. Are you family? No friend? Riding partner? Ethan shook his head. Turned her. I found her. The nurse looked at him for a moment, really looked at him, taking in the torn jacket, the dirty hands, the cut on his palm he hadn't even thought about, the expression on his face that wasn't relief or pride or anything like that, and quieter. She's lucky you came along, the nurse said. Ethan just nodded. He waited in the hallway for a while, wasn't sure why. There was nothing he could tell them that he hadn't already told them, nothing he could do that the doctors couldn't do better. But he found himself sitting in a hard plastic chair under fluorescent lights, hands folded in his lap, watching the clock on the wall. The doctor came out 40 minutes later, not to talk to Ethan specifically, but to speak to a young man late 20s, agitated, had arrived 20 minutes after Ethan and had been pacing the waiting room with barely contained panic. Ethan assumed he was a family member, a brother, maybe. A resemblance around the jaw and the eyes was faint but there. The doctor spoke quietly. Ethan caught only fragments from across the room. Fickle but stable. Surgery in the morning. Another hour without intervention and the internal bleeding. The young man pressed both hands over his face. The doctor put a hand on his shoulder. Ethan looked at the clock. It was nearly 2 a.m. He stood up, walked to the nurse's station. A different nurse, this time older, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. Who came in? Ethan said quietly. The motorcycle accident. With her? The nurse checked the screen. Her family is being notified. Someone's on their way. Good, Ethan said. Want me to write down your name so they can contact you? Ethan thought about it for exactly 1 second. Oh, he said, that's all right. He walked back out into the night. His truck was still at the emergency bay, and someone had very politely moved it to the side so other vehicles could get through. He found a note under his windshield wiper, handwritten, but whoever had moved it, that said simply, thank you for what you did. He put the note in his glove box. He drove home through the darkness with the windows down. The cold desert air moved through the truck. He didn't turn on the radio, didn't feel the need for noise. Silence was a different kind of silence now, not the empty kind he usually came home to. Something fuller, something that felt, for just a little while, like enough. He pulled into his gravel driveway and sat in the truck for a moment before getting out. At his house, the porch light he always left on, third wooden door, the window of the front room where he'd spent 10,000 quiet evenings doing nothing in particular. Oh, he said to nobody. He climbed out of the truck. He noticed his hand was still bleeding a little from the scrub brush. Forgotten about it entirely. He went inside, ran it under the tap, a bandage on it, made himself a glass of water. In the kitchen, in his dirty clothes, and drank it slowly. Then he went to bed. He lay in the darkness and thought not about heroes or fate or the strange roads that bring strangers together at the right moment, about the transmission job at 8, about whether the shop had enough brake fluid, whether Rust would have liked the excitement. Probably would have, he decided. Rust had liked excitement, always wanted to be where the action was, even when he was too old and too fat to do anything about it. Ethan smiled in the dark. He was asleep within 15 minutes. A while, for a short unknowing, while he had no idea that 400 miles away, a room thick with cigarette smoke and leather and the kind of silence that meant something serious had happened, a call was coming in that would change everything. The idea that a man named Jackson Whitmore had just heard 3 words that stopped him cold. Where she's going to live. And the second 3 words, spoken immediately after, lit something different in his eyes. Someone saved her. He had no idea that Jackson Whitmore, a man who had built a life on debt and loyalty, the iron code that said you never let a debt go unrepaid, had just asked a single question in a voice so quiet that the men in the room held their breath to hear it. and that when nobody had an answer, the look on Jackson Whitmore's face told every single one of them that finding out was not a request. It was a mission. Ethan Caldwell slept soundly. The wheels were already turning. 3 days passed. Ethan fixed the transmission. He charged the customer fairly, shook hands, watched the car pull out of his gravel lot, and went back inside the shop. He ate a sandwich over the workbench. He listened to the radio country station out of Tucson that played older stuff, the kind of music that didn't try too hard. He swept the floor at 5 o'clock the way he always did, locked up the shop at 5:30 the way he always did, drove home the way he always did. He did not think about the woman in the ditch, or rather he tried not to. She crept in anyway during the quiet moments, ones that used to be filled with Russ snoring. Himself staring at the ceiling at 2 in the morning, running the night back through his mind like a film reel he couldn't switch off. Tire marks, the spinning wheel, the sound of her breathing that wasn't quite right, the way the nurses had moved with such precision when he pulled up to that emergency bay, like they'd been expecting him, like everything he'd done had been exactly correct. She was okay. He had no way of knowing. He hadn't left his name. That asked for hers. The hospital wouldn't tell him anything, even if he called privacy rules. He knew that much, and besides, calling would feel like something. Like he wanted credit, like he'd done it for a reason beyond the obvious one. He hadn't. He'd done it because she was there, and she needed help, and he was the only one around. That was the whole story. At least, that's what he told himself. But on the fourth morning, he was under a pickup truck. Different pickup truck, customers, a 2003 Ford with a leaking exhaust manifold when he heard tires on the gravel. He slid out from under the truck and wiped his hands on his work rag and saw a car he didn't recognize. Clean black sedan, not new but well-maintained. Arizona plates. There's 2 men inside. The men got out. They weren't threatening in any obvious way, no raised voices, aggressive body language, but something about them made Ethan pay attention. Both in their 30s, one tall, one shorter, wearing jeans and plain jackets. The taller one had the kind of careful, measured way of moving that Ethan had seen before in men who had spent time in situations where moving wrong cost you something. "Caldwell?" the tall one said. Ethan looked at him steadily. "On who's asking?" "My name is Derek Holt." The man didn't extend his hand. "Not yet. I work for Jackson Whitmore." The name meant nothing to Ethan. He showed no reaction because there was none to show. "No, a Jackson Whitmore," Ethan said. Derek Holt nodded slowly. That was exactly what he'd expected to hear. "Last Tuesday night, 89, near mile marker 147. You stopped at an accident." Ethan's hands went still on the work rag. "Pulled a woman out of a ditch," Derek continued. "Her to St. Mary's. Left before anyone could get your name." Ethan said nothing. "To the nurses. We talked to the doctor. To the highway patrol officer who investigated the scene and found evidence of a second vehicle, your tire tracks." "Oh, where you'd pulled over," Derek paused. "It took us 3 days to find you." "Caldwell, you're not an easy man to locate." "I'm not hiding," Ethan said. "I'm working, I can see that." Derek glanced at the Ford on the lift, and back at Ethan. "The woman you saved is named Claire Whitmore. She's Jackson Whitmore's wife. He wants to meet you." Ethan considered that for a moment. He looked at the 2 men. He looked at the black sedan, about what it meant that a man he didn't know had spent 3 days tracking him down. Right?" Ethan asked. "Claire, is she okay?" Derek blinked. But that wasn't the question he'd been prepared for. He'd been braced for negotiation or suspicion, or a demand to know what the meeting would involve. "Recovering," Derek said. "Surgery went well. Doctors say she'll be on her feet in a few weeks." "Good," Ethan said simply. "That's good." He went back to folding his work rag, lit it once, twice, set it on the workbench. "Well, Mr. Whitmore, I'm glad she's recovering. And I appreciate him going to the trouble of finding me. I don't need a meeting. I didn't do anything that requires a meeting." Derek stared at him. The shorter man, who hadn't said a single word since getting out of the car, exchanged a quick look with Derek, a look that communicated something along the lines of, "Mr. Caldwell, Derek said carefully. Jackson Whitmore is not a man who makes requests lightly. And he's not a man whose requests are typically declined. Ethan looked up from the workbench. His expression was even, unhurried, without any particular edge to it, but it also wasn't backing down. Well, Ethan said, I'm not a man who does things for meetings or rewards or recognition. I did what I did because it was the right thing to do. Period. Now, if Mr. Whitmore wants to send a card or something, that's fine. But I've got a manifold to fix and a customer coming at 3. He picked up a wrench and went back to the truck. Derek Holt stood in the gravel lot for a long moment. He did something that surprised Ethan. He almost smiled, just at the corner of his mouth. Almost. I'll tell him what you said, Derek said. Here. You do that, said Ethan from under the truck. He heard the sedan doors close. The gravel crunch. As they backed out, he heard them drive away, under the Ford for a long time after that, without actually doing anything to it. A mind was moving in ways he hadn't expected. Not about Jackson Whitmore, or the meeting, or what any of it meant. He was thinking about Claire, about the sound of her breathing in the back of his truck. The way the nurses had taken over the moment he arrived, efficient and capable in everything she'd needed, and about how she'd survived. The surgery had gone well. She was going to be on her feet in a few weeks. He hadn't known that until 30 seconds ago. He realized he'd been carrying around the not knowing like a stone in his chest. Constant, he'd stopped noticing the weight of it, and now suddenly it was gone. She was all right. He closed his eyes under the truck, and the smell of oil and metal and old exhaust, and for just a second, he let himself feel the full force of that relief. Then he picked up the wrench and got back to work. What he didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, was that Derek Holt had pulled the black sedan over exactly half a mile down the road on the phone before the dust had settled. He turned it down, Derek said. I was on the line. Then a voice, low measured, carrying the kind of weight that came from decades of being the person everyone else answered to. He turned it down. It wasn't a question. It was Jackson Whitmore absorbing a piece of information that didn't fit into any category he'd prepared for. He said he didn't want a meeting. Said he did what anyone should have done. And he had work to finish. Another pause. Hunger. He asked about Claire, Derek added. First thing, anything else, he wanted to know if she was all right. The silence on the other end of the line stretched out so long that Derek thought the call might have dropped. Then Jackson Whitmore said 4 words, quiet and absolute. Myself. Derek closed his eyes briefly. When? Tell me everything about him. Everything you found. I want to know who this man is before I walk through his door. Derek looked at the notes on his phone. 3 days of thorough Ethan Ray Caldwell, 58 years old, born in Flagstaff, spent his 20s working auto shops in Phoenix and Albuquerque. Volunteer search and rescue. Maricopa County, 11 years. Retired from that after a back injury in 2021. Lost his wife, Linda Caldwell, their son, to cancer in 2014. No children, no debt, no criminal record, not even a speeding ticket. Owns the shop outright in 2009. Lives alone. Dog died 2 years ago. He paused. No social media. No online presence. Doesn't seem to want one. Jackson said nothing. To 2 people in town who know him, and I mean the kind of know where they see him every week at the hardware store. He's the guy who helps without being asked. Breaks down at 2 in the morning. Ethan's there. And he needs a part they can't afford. Ethan finds a way. Advertise it. Doesn't talk about it. Just does it. The line was very quiet. Jackson, Derek said. And it was the first time he'd used the first name, as the moment seemed to call for it. This man is the real thing. Jackson Whitmore's voice, when it finally came back, was different. Still quiet, controlled, but underneath it just barely, like heat coming off pavement, something that Derek had heard very rarely in 20 years of working for this man. Set it up, Jackson said. Next weekend. Derek started to say something about logistics, the distance, about whether they should call ahead, but Jackson had already ended the call. The following week moved strangely for Ethan. He had the sensation irrational. He knew that something was different in the air around him. He'd shake it off during the day, get absorbed in the work, in the familiar rhythms of the shop, and then at night it would come back. Oh, undefined feeling, like pressure before rain. Himself, it was nothing. Wednesday morning, Glenn stopped by. Glenn Archer was 62, hired mail carrier, who had lived 4 miles down the road for 15 years, and who came by the shop every week or so to drink Ethan's terrible coffee and talk about baseball and occasionally ask advice about his own aging pickup truck. Glenn walked in, poured himself a cup without asking they were passed that sat on the wooden stool by the parts shelf, and looked at Ethan with the expression of a man who was working up to something, then waited. I heard something, Glenn said finally. You usually do, Ethan said, not looking up from the carburetor he was rebuilding. I heard you pulled someone out of a wreck a couple weeks ago. On 89. Ethan's hands kept moving. Where'd you hear that? Tom Briggs. Ethan works dispatch. Word gets around. Word always gets around, Ethan muttered. You didn't say anything about it. Nothing to say. Glenn was quiet for a moment. Then Ethan. They're saying the woman you saved, she's connected to some serious people. Ethan set down the carburetor. Looked at Glenn directly for the first time since he'd walked in. What kind of serious people? Glenn wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. Angels are kind of serious. The shop was very quiet. The radio was off for once. The compressor was idle. Outside, a truck passed on the road, and the sound of it faded quickly into nothing. Hell's Angels, Ethan said, without inflection. That's what Tom said. He said the woman's husband is somebody with a lot of people behind him. Glenn looked at Ethan carefully. Right? Ethan thought about the two men in the black sedan. Derek Holt with his careful movements and his prepared speech and the name he'd been given, Jackson Whitmore. The way Derek had paused when Ethan asked about Claire first. I'm fine, Ethan said. These aren't people you want to be in debt to or have in debt to you. Either way, she was a person who needed help. All it was. Glenn stared at him. You knew? I didn't know anything. I still don't know much. Some men came to the shop earlier this week. The woman's husband wanted to meet me. I told them. No. Glenn's coffee mug stopped halfway to his lips. Told Hell's Angels no. I told two men in a sedan no. I wasn't rude about it. Glenn put the mug down very carefully. Raymond Caldwell. Don't. I'm just saying, Glenn, I'm just saying that some doors you don't close. Okay. Glenn picked the mug back up, drank from it. Set it down, looked at the wall. You're the most stubborn man I've ever known in my life. I was married for 31 years, so that is saying something. Ethan almost smiled. Appreciate it. Did they seem, were they threatening? Ethan thought about it honestly. Opposite, actually. They were respectful. Even. He paused. The one doing the talking when I said no almost smiled, like he couldn't quite believe it but found it funny somehow. Glenn processed that. What happens now? Ethan picked the carburetor back up. I finished this carburetor. And if they come back? If they come back, Ethan said, tell them the same thing I told them before. Glenn left an hour later, shaking his head in a way that communicated both admiration and exasperation in equal measure. Ethan watched his truck disappear down the road and felt, for a moment, the slight hollow feeling that came with being an uncomplicated man in a complicated situation. Well, he wasn't afraid of Jackson Whitmore. He wasn't afraid of the Hell's Angels. He wasn't trying to be brave about it. Either it was something simpler than bravery. He genuinely did not believe that what he'd done created any kind of obligation, any entanglement, any web he now had to navigate. He'd helped a woman. She survived. That was the end of the transaction as far as he was concerned. Something Glenn had said stayed with him. Some doors you don't close. He chewed on that while he finished the carburetor. Chewed on it while he swept the shop floor at 5. On it while he drove home. While he made dinner eggs and toast. Complicated while he sat in his chair after eating and looked out the window at the desert darkening toward evening. Some doors you don't close. He wasn't sure if that applied here. He wasn't sure if a man like Jackson Whitmore coming to thank a man like Ethan Caldwell was a door that should be opened or left exactly where it was. Saturday morning changed the question entirely. Ethan was on the porch with his coffee at 6:45 early, the way he always was, because The desert mornings were the best part of the day, and he refused to sleep through them. I was that particular shade of orange and pink that only happened in the 20 minutes before the sun fully cleared the horizon. There still, a pair of quail somewhere nearby, flying back and forth in the brush. He heard it before he understood what he was hearing. Around, deep and rhythmic, coming from the direction of the road. At first, it was a truck, a big one, maybe two, but it didn't resolve into engine noise the way a truck would. Instead, layered, multiplied, got louder and more complex as it came closer. The mug stopped at his lips. The sound was wrong for trucks. Rhythmic, too synchronized, too numerous. He set the mug down. He stood up from his porch chair. He walked to the edge of the porch and looked toward the road, squinting into the morning light. The first motorcycle appeared over the rise. Another, then 10 more, then 50, then more than he could count. His brain tried to process what his eyes were showing him and couldn't quite get there, because the image didn't fit any category of normal morning experience. His road, the small county road that saw maybe 6 vehicles an hour on a busy day, was filling. It was full. A wall, eyes into horizon, unbroken column of motorcycles, engines merging into a single sound that was less like noise and more like something geological, something the earth was doing. The patches on the jackets became visible as they got closer. Ethan's hands went very still at his sides. He didn't move. He didn't reach for the phone. He didn't do anything except stand on his porch and watch as the column of motorcycles turned, all of them, in coordinated motion, like a river changing direction off the road and onto the gravel track that led to his property. It came in silence except for the engines. No shouting, aggression, no theater, just the weight of their numbers filling the space in front of his home, surrounding his gravel lot, lining the fence, spreading across the ground like the tide coming in. One by one, the engines cut out. The silence that replaced the sound was a different kind of silence, the silence of hundreds of people choosing to be quiet. Ethan stood on his porch. He counted as best he could. He stopped when he passed 400. He was still counting when the last motorcycle found its place and the final engine died. And in the stillness that followed, one man walked forward from the group, gray-haired, a heavy beard shot through with silver. His jacket was worn with the kind of use that had no performance in it, real use, years of it. He walked through the open space between his people and Ethan's porch with the unhurried confidence of a man who knew exactly where he was going. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps. He looked up at Ethan. "Well," he said. "Not a question." "I am," Ethan said. "Jackson Whitmore." The two men looked at each other across the 3 steps between them. Ethan had expected a lot of things in that moment: anger, maybe, or that particular brand of aggressive gratitude that was really just power wearing a friendlier mask. He'd expected to feel small, maybe, or cornered. He'd expected to feel afraid. He didn't feel any of those things. What he felt, looking at Jackson Whitmore, was unexpected. He felt like he was looking at a man in pain. Not fresh pain, not the sharp, loud kind, the other kind, that had been living in a person for years, but functional through discipline and will, and then had nearly lost the one thing that kept it from overwhelming everything. Jackson Whitmore had almost lost his wife, and this man, this mechanic on his porch with his morning coffee, had been the difference. Club said nothing for a moment, just looked at Ethan with the steady, evaluating look of a man who had spent a lifetime reading other men and knew better than most what he was seeing. Then he said quietly, "My guys told me you said no." "I did," Ethan said. "Why?" A pause. "You said you didn't do anything that required a meeting." "Still think that?" Jackson nodded slowly. "I'm here." Ethan frowned slightly. "That doesn't quite make sense." "It does," Jackson said, "to me." He put one hand on the porch railing, not threatening, just resting it there. A human gesture, a man steadying himself for something he'd planned to say and was now feeling the full weight of. "Says, I've been doing this a long time, Mr. Caldwell. Running this organization, managing men and problems and situations most people never see. That time, in all those years, I can count on one hand the number of people who did something for me or mine with absolutely nothing in it for themselves. He met Ethan's eyes. You're the only one who turned down the meeting. Ethan said nothing. Do you know how many people would have shown up to that meeting? Jackson said. How many people would have come in with a list of things they needed? How many would have turned one good act into an angle? I'm not interested in angles, Ethan said. Know that, Jackson said. That's the point. He looked over his shoulder at the 400 and more riders standing in absolute silence behind him. Then he turned back to Ethan. And for a moment, just a moment, something crossed his face that was raw and unguarded and completely at odds with the controlled, commanding presence he'd carried through the gate. Called me from the hospital, Jackson said. His voice dropped slightly, the way voices do when the words being said are too large for full volume. There, when she came out of surgery. First thing she said to me, first thing was that someone had stayed with her, to her, kept talking the whole time he was carrying her. Her about a transmission job and a customer at 8 in the morning. He stopped and felt something shift in his chest. She said she could hear your voice, Jackson said, even when she couldn't respond to it. She said it was the only reason she didn't let go. The desert was very quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called once and went silent. Ethan stood on his porch with his hands at his sides and his empty coffee mug on the railing beside him, and he felt the full weight of those words land on him in a way he hadn't expected and couldn't entirely defend against. She heard him. She heard him talking about the transmission job. Heard him say she was going to make it through tonight, and so was he. And she held on. He didn't know what to say. He wasn't a man who usually didn't know what to say. He was used to silence, comfortable with it, never felt the need to fill every quiet with words. This was different. This was the kind of moment that could make a grown man completely lose his footing if he wasn't careful. Jackson Whitmore saw all of that on Ethan's face. He saw it and he let it sit there. Then he said very simply, "Can I come up?" Ethan looked at him for a second longer. Then he stepped back from the porch steps and held the door open. "Coffee's on," Ethan said. Jackson Whitmore walked up those 3 porch steps like a man who had climbed harder things and knew it. He didn't look around when he came inside. He didn't take inventory of the house or didn't make any kind of assessment that Ethan could detect. He just came in, accepted the mug Ethan held out to him with both hands, and sat down at the kitchen table like a man who was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. Ethan sat across from him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Just 2 men with coffee, morning light coming through the window, distant sound of 400 motorcycles worth of people, doing whatever 400 people do when they're waiting outside someone's house and trying to be respectful about it. "How do you take it?" Ethan had asked before pouring. Like Jackson said. Ethan had almost smiled. Same. Now they sat with their black coffee in the quiet between them. And Ethan let it stretch because he'd learned long ago that the person who felt the need to fill silence first was usually the one with more to prove. But he had nothing to prove. This was his kitchen. Jackson spoke first. "She told me something else," he said. He was looking at the mug at Ethan about that night. Ethan waited. "She said she remembers the smell of motor oil." Jackson looked up then. "She said it was the first thing she was aware of even before the pain, before she understood what had happened. Just that smell." In a voice, he stopped. His jaw tightened slightly, the way a jaw does when a man is maintaining control over something that would rather not be controlled. "Debaters," she said, the voice never panicked. Jackson continued. "Sure." She said that was the thing, that she could tell, even barely conscious, or even in that kind of pain, that the person talking to her wasn't afraid. Somehow that made her not afraid. Ethan set his mug down. "I was afraid," he said honestly. "I just didn't have time to be." Jackson looked at him for a long moment. "That's the most accurate description of courage I've ever heard." Ethan shook his head slightly. "Not courage. That's just focus." "Most men can't find focus when it matters," Jackson said. "Most men freeze or run or make it worse. You didn't." He paused. "What did you know what to do?" "Search and rescue. 11 years, Maricopa County, volunteer unit." Ethan turned the mug in his hands. "Said when my back gave out. But the training doesn't quit." "How long ago?" "Few years now." Jackson nodded. Down at his coffee again. Then he said something that shifted the temperature of the whole conversation. I need to tell you something about that night. Something you don't know. Ethan went still. Claire wasn't alone when she left that evening, Jackson said. "Uh, She was supposed to have two riders with her, two of our people, experienced, who ride that route regularly. His voice was controlled, deliberate, but something underneath it had the texture of a man who had spent 2 weeks trying not to say what he was about to say. They're back about 40 miles out. Weather looked bad. They'll pull off and wait it out." He looked up. They left her riding alone on a mountain road in the dark. And when they found out what happened, when they heard she'd gone down, they didn't report it. They drove home and went to bed and let someone else find her. The kitchen was absolutely silent. Then processed that slowly. The weight of it was significant, not because of what it meant in terms of loyalty or code or the internal politics of a group he didn't belong to, because of what it meant in simple human terms. Two people who were supposed to be watching out for Claire Whitmore had decided that their own comfort was more important. A choice had gone to bed. Did she know? Ethan asked quietly. Until last week. Jackson's hands tightened around the mug. Told her, I thought she had a right to know. How did she take it? Better than I did. He exhaled slowly. Me not to do anything permanent. Ethan watched the man across the table and understood suddenly that this visit was not only about gratitude, also about something. Jackson Whitmore needed something he couldn't get from his own people, who were either involved in the situation or too close to it to be neutral. He needed to sit across from the one person who had been there that night with nothing to gain or lose, and say the things out loud that had been sitting in his chest for 2 weeks. He needed a witness. Ethan, without planning it, asking for it. Those two men, Ethan said, keeping his voice even. Still with you? Jackson met his eyes. That's being handled. Ethan nodded once. He didn't ask for details. That wasn't his world. But he understood the code, not because he agreed with every part of it, but because he'd lived long enough to understand that every community had one, but the violation of it had consequences. She's really going to be all right? Ethan asked. It was the second time he'd asked. He wasn't embarrassed about it. Something moved across Jackson's face that was entirely unguarded. He said, and his voice was rougher than it had been a moment ago. She's going to be fine. She's already arguing with the doctors about when she can ride again. Ethan raised an eyebrow. What are the doctors saying? 8 weeks minimum. And what is she saying? 4. Jackson almost smiled. Already won 2 arguments with the nursing staff and convinced her physical therapist to revise the recovery timelines. My wife does not accept other people's schedules. Ethan laughed out of him genuinely and unexpectedly, and it filled the kitchen in a way that felt like it had been needed for a while. Jackson laughed too, briefly, but real. And in that brief, real moment of 2 men laughing about a stubborn woman who refused to follow recovery timelines, something settled between them. Some layer of formality or distance that had been present since Jackson walked through the door quietly dissolved. What was left was just 2 men at a table who had been through something in their different ways and who were both still standing. Jack drained the last of his coffee. I owe you more than I can repay, he said. I know that. And I know you said you don't want anything. Oh, I need you to understand something, Mr. Caldwell. The world, debts matter. Not as a transaction, not as business, as a matter of who you are. He set the mug down. You saved the life of the person I love most in this world. I can't just shake your hand and drive away. Ethan was quiet for a moment. But he did more than I asked for, he said. You told me she's all right. Told me she heard my voice. He paused. That's enough. More than enough. It's not enough for me, Jackson said. And that's what I'm asking you to let me carry. Not your obligation. Ethan looked at this man across his kitchen table, this man who commanded hundreds of riders and had built a life inside a code that most people only heard about secondhand and understood poorly, and saw, underneath all of it, something very familiar. A man who needed to be allowed to do something. A man who, if he couldn't repay this particular debt, carry the weight of it in a way that would cost him more than any concrete gesture ever could. Ethan understood that deeply. He'd carried his own debts, the ones nobody else knew about, the ones that didn't have names or categories, the ones that just lived in you. Got it. All right, he said. Jackson looked at him. Right, what? All right, you can carry it. A pause. Then Jackson said, that's not exactly what I meant. I know what you meant, Ethan said. I'm not going to sit here and make you a list. You do what you think is right. I trust your judgment on that. Jackson studied him. Careful. The way a man studies something he can't quite categorize. As people, Jackson said slowly, when they hear the words Hell's Angels owe you a favor, they go pale or they immediately start thinking about what they can get out of it. I'm not most people, Ethan said. No, Jackson agreed. You are absolutely not. He stood up. Ethan stood up too, not because he felt obligated, but because it felt like the right thing. Always operated on that metric. Jackson extended his hand and Ethan took it. Leonard said, and the handshake was firm and brief and meant something that neither man needed to articulate. Back out to the porch. What happened next was something Ethan would spend a long time afterward trying to find the right words for and never quite manage it. Jackson stepped down off the porch and turned to face his people. 100 and some riders, standing in the morning sun, had been silent, watching. Jackson didn't give a speech, raised his voice enough to carry. This is Ethan Caldwell, he said. He found Claire on Route 89 2 weeks ago. He carried her out of a ditch, took her to the hospital. He saved her life. A pause. He didn't leave his name. He didn't ask for anything. I've been going to work every morning like it never happened. Not a single person in that crowd made a sound. 30 years, Jackson said. I have never met a man more deserving of respect. He turned back to Ethan. Then he did something that made every one of those 400 people draw a breath at the same moment. Jackson Whitmore reached up with both hands and began to remove his vest. His brow furrowed. He didn't understand what he was looking at immediately, but the crowd understood. The crowd understood immediately because there was an almost audible shift in the energy, a collective intake of breath, a stillness that went a quality deeper than the stillness before it. Jackson held the vest in both hands. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Ethan. This is the most important thing I own, he said quietly. Ethan alone. Not for what it's worth. For what it means, he turned it over in his hands. I've worn it for 31 years. It's been through more than I can explain. He paused. I'm not giving it to you. I want to be clear about that it wouldn't mean the same thing to you as it does to me. Well, and that's fine. I'm showing it to you because I want you to understand what I'm saying. He held it against his chest, acted according to the highest code I know. Code older than any patch or vest or organization. You saw someone who needed help, and you helped them. Completely, without condition. His voice controlled and steady all morning, roughed slightly at its edges. In my world, that earns more than money. Than favors, it earns this. He raised his right fist to his chest, pulls in, a gesture that was clearly formal, a salute of some kind, a specific and practiced gesture that carried specific meaning within a world Ethan didn't fully know. From behind him, from 400 people simultaneously, same gesture, every right fist, every chest, every rider, a perfect unison, a signal, a command, as they already knew. The sound of it, of that many fists striking that many chests at the same moment, was like a single heartbeat amplified across the desert morning. But Ethan's throat closed. He was not a man who cried. I recall on the cordon, he hadn't cried at Linda's funeral, though he'd wanted to have held it together because he'd thought that was what strength looked like. Had spent years afterward not being sure he'd been right about that. He cried when Russ died, though he'd sat on the floor of the kitchen next to the old dog's bed for an hour afterward and hadn't moved. He didn't cry now, but it was close. It was closer than anything had been in a very long time. He stood on his porch with 400 people honoring him and felt, in a way he couldn't have anticipated, utterly exposed, in a threatening way. In the way that happens when something sees you, really sees you, actual you. the one that had been going to work and coming home, and existing quietly in the world without anyone particularly noticing, and decides that you matter. He's 12 years, not mattering to very many people. He hadn't minded. But standing there in the desert morning, with 400 right fists against 400 chests, he realized that he'd been wrong about something. He'd thought not needing recognition was the same as not needing to be seen. It wasn't. He cleared his throat. I don't know what to say, he admitted. Look, you don't have to say anything, Jackson said. That's not I usually have something. He stopped. Not again. She heard my voice, he said finally. That's going to stay with me for a long time. Good, Jackson said. She's going to want to tell you herself. When she's back on her feet, he looked at Ethan with complete directness. Let me promise. Ethan blinked. What? She's going to want to thank you. Personally, he paused. She also said, and I'm quoting here, tell him he had better not disappear again. I've been trying to find him for 2 weeks. Something about the phrasing, the specificity of it, the image of Claire Whitmore, frustrated in a hospital bed, trying to find the man who'd talked to her about transmission jobs. Something about all of that hit Ethan in a place so unexpected that he almost laughed and almost did something else entirely at the same time. Claire, she sounds like someone worth knowing, Ethan said. She's the best person I've ever met, Jackson said. Qualification, no modesty, no performance. Just fact. For a moment they stood there in the morning air, and the weight of everything that had happened in the past 2 weeks, the accident, the recovery, their search, visit, this morning settled around them like something tangible. Then Jackson turned and looked at his riders. Then back at Ethan. I'm gonna stay a while, he said. If that's all right with you. Ethan glanced at the crowd. I wasn't under the impression I had much say in that. You have total say, Jackson said immediately. And he meant it. We leave if you want us to leave. You say the word. Ethan looked out at 400 people standing in the morning sun on his property. About his fence, which had been leaning since last spring. About his truck, which had developed a new noise he hadn't had time to investigate. About the workshop roof that needed patching and the shed door that hadn't closed properly since the wind got it in February. About how quiet Saturday mornings usually were. About how quiet every morning usually was. He looked at Jackson. You said you needed to repay a debt, he said. Ethan's eyes were steady. I meant it. Ethan took a breath. Let it out. He was not a man who accepted help easily. Linda used to call it his most charming flaw. He could spend 3 hours fixing something himself that would have taken 20 minutes with one extra pair of hands because asking didn't come naturally. She'd said it with affection. She said it with a specific kind of exasperation that only the people who love you most can manage. About Linda. She'd have had something to say about this morning. Being sharp and warm and exactly right, the way she always did. Wasn't sure what it would have been, but he had the feeling it would have involved the words about time and also probably something about his stubbornness. He'd been stubborn long enough. There's a fence out back that's been wanting attention since April, Ethan said. Jackson didn't smile, exactly, but something in his face shifted into a kind of satisfaction that was deeper than a smile. Tell me where the tools are. Shop's unlocked, Ethan said. That was how it began. What happened over the next several hours was something that Ethan would not have been able to describe to anyone who hadn't seen it, because the description would have sounded impossible. 100 members of the Hells Angels, organized with a quiet efficiency that surprised him at first and then didn't surprise him at all, because these were people who knew how to work, who had built and maintained and repaired things with their own hands for most of their lives, spread across his property, and began to address every problem that the place had accumulated. There are 12 years of one man living and working alone. Theirs went first. A team of 6 moved on it with the kind of coordinated purpose that only comes from people who've worked together before, abouters, who know how to divide a task without talking about it. Ethan watched them from across the yard for a moment. They went to help, and one of the men, a big quiet man in his 40s, who introduced himself only as Brecky handed him a post hole digger without a word, and they worked side by side for an hour. without exchanging more than the minimum of communication necessary, which turned out to be exactly the right amount. The truck was next. Three men who apparently knew engines as well as Ethan did, or close to it, had the hood up within 20 minutes of getting access to the shop. On the noise, a loose heat shield on the exhaust. They 2 minutes to fix it properly. One of them told Ethan afterward, in a matter-of-fact tone, that he'd also noticed the front brake pads were getting thin, and did Ethan want them to take care of that while they were in there? And Ethan said yes. He said yes a lot that morning. It didn't come naturally. Every time he opened his mouth to say, I can handle that or no, right, he remembered what Glenn had said, what Jackson had said, pulled the reflex and said yes, and each time he did it, got a fraction easier, like exercising a muscle that had atrophied from disuse. And showed up around 10:30. He drove up the road, on to the gravel track, and stopped his truck at the entrance to the property, where it became physically impossible to proceed because of the sheer density of motorcycles. He sat there for a moment. Then he got out of the truck and walked the rest of the way on foot, weaving between spikes, his head turning in every direction with the expression of a man who had prepared himself for a lot of things in life, but not quite this particular configuration. He found Ethan at the back fence with Brecky and two other riders. I stood next to Ethan and looked at the scene in silence for approximately 30 seconds. Glenn said, "Here being Glenn." Ethan said, "There's not stopping what he was doing." Glenn said again, "You said that already." Ethan. Glenn's voice had a specific quality to it. There are 400 Hells Angels in your yard. About that, they're fixing your fence and the truck. And the truck. Glenn stared. What's happening with the roof of the workshop? Ethan glanced over. Calm. Three men were up on the workshop roof with materials he didn't remember having, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had done roof work before and done it properly. Roof, Ethan said, is apparently also being Glenn turned to look at him. At him for a long moment. His voice, when he finally spoke, quieter than before, quieter, and different in a way that wasn't about volume. "Then," he said, "when's the last time when someone did something like this for you?" Ethan drove a post into the ground. Hit firm. Didn't look up. "It's been a while," he said. Nodded slowly. Then he rolled up his sleeves. "Where do you need me?" And that small, simple, fairly characteristic Glenn Archer move, the quiet decision to not stand watching, but to come in and help, was the thing that almost got Ethan. And the fist salute. More than Jackson's words about the vest, than the sound of 400 engines filling his road in the morning. It was Glenn rolling up his sleeves, because that was his person. That was the one person in his daily life who just showed up, reliably, without drama. And seeing that person show up in the middle of something this extraordinary, standing there in his old flannel shirt beside a man named Brecky, who had forearms like oak branches, made the whole thing suddenly completely real. Ethan put down the digger. He straightened up. He put his hand on Glenn's shoulder briefly, one firm grip, kind that said everything it needed to say without saying any of it out loud. Ethan said and pointed. Glenn nodded. On it. It was around noon when Jackson found Ethan at the edge of the property, where the fence ran along the back and the desert stretched out beyond it in every direction. Ethan had stopped working for a moment, not from tiredness, from something he couldn't quite name. The need to stand still for a minute and be in the middle of it rather than moving through it. He heard Jackson's boots on the ground beside him before he heard anything else. Stood together, looking out at the desert. "You've been alone out here a long time," Jackson said. And a question. And it wasn't quite a statement either. Kind of thing said by someone who recognized a particular quality of solitude that Ethan carried, as they were familiar enough with it themselves to identify it in someone else. "Bob died," Ethan said. 2014. "I know," Jackson said quietly. Cancer, I'm sorry." Ethan nodded. He wasn't going to make a thing of it. He never did. Colorado. But he let the acknowledgement sit for a moment, which was more than he usually did. "Almost lost each other twice," Jackson said. "Claire and me. This." He paused. "Once was my fault. The other time was just life being what it is." Another pause. "But I'll tell you both times, Nothing else mattered. Everything I'd built, everything I'd protected, all the codes and the loyalty and the organization, none of it was worth anything against the thought of losing her. Ethan looked at him sideways. Are you telling me this? Because you carried her to safety, Jackson said. Some moment I wasn't there to do it. And I need you to understand. I need you to actually understand what that means to me. He turned to face Ethan directly. Sir, you didn't just save a life. You saved mine. The desert absorbed that statement. Sir, Ethan turned it over. He thought about what it actually meant, not as an abstraction, not as a figure of speech, but as a real and concrete truth. Claire died on Route 89. Jackson Whitmore would have lost the center of his life. Organizing principle. The thing that made everything else make sense. Ethan knew what that loss felt like. He'd felt it himself, his own way, in 2014. And the years after it, he knew exactly what Jackson was describing. I stopped, Ethan said, simply. Finally, as a performance of modesty or humility, but because it was the truest thing he could say. Well, am I, Jackson said, every day for the rest of my life. From somewhere across the yard, I started laughing at something, a burst of real laughter, uncomplicated kind. The kind that happens when people are working together and something goes unexpectedly sideways. It broke the weight of the moment cleanly, and both men turned toward the sound. Two of Jackson's riders and Glenn Archer were standing by the shed, looking at something that had apparently not gone according to plan with the shed door. All three of them were laughing in the way that adult men laugh when something is genuinely funny and they've stopped caring about being dignified about it. Ethan watched Glenn throw his head back and laugh with a man he'd never met before this morning. He felt something loosen in his chest, something he hadn't even known was tight. You know what I haven't done in a long time, he said, almost to himself. Jackson looked at him. What? Had a full yard, Ethan said. Jackson was quiet for a moment. Then, how long? Ethan thought about it honestly. Linda's last Christmas, 2013. The house had been full. Then her sister's kids, two of their old friends from Phoenix, the neighbor from down the road who had nowhere to go for the holidays. A full that was loud and warm and slightly chaotic and entirely alive. 12 years, he said. Jackson said nothing. He reached into his jacket and pulled out something small and metal and held it out to Ethan. Looked at it, a card small, matte black, with a number engraved on it in simple silver. No title, just the number. If you ever need anything, Jackson said, anything at all, you call that number and someone answers. Doesn't matter when, doesn't matter what. Ethan took it, read it, turned it over in his hand. The metal was heavy for its size. I'm not going to abuse it, Ethan said. I know that, Jackson said. I'm giving it to you. Ethan put the card in his shirt pocket, felt the slight weight of it there. This is yours now, Jackson said. Theirs, not mine, yours. He met Ethan's eyes. There, your family. You didn't ask to be. You didn't earn it by any of the usual methods. Ethan looked at him steadily. That's a big thing to say. Yes, Jackson said. And he said it again, without the hesitation, the qualifier, with the absolute flatness of a man stating the clearest fact he knows. The riders left around 4 in the afternoon. All at once, they drifted out in groups. The way people leave a gathering when the work is done and the day has gone long enough in the best possible way. Some shook Ethan's hand. Some just nodded. A few said things, simple things, kind that don't require a response, and Ethan accepted all of it with the same quiet steadiness he'd maintained since morning. Brecky was one of the last to go. He walked past Ethan on his way to his bike, looked at the fence line they'd rebuilt together, looked at Ethan. Good posts, he said. Good work, Ethan said. Eric nodded once, got on his bike, left. Glenn stayed until everyone was gone. He stood next to Ethan in the gravel lot, and they watched the last few motorcycles disappear down the road, fading gradually until the desert reclaimed its usual quiet. The door was fixed. The fence was solid. The truck sat in the lot with new brake pads and a heat shield that no longer rattled. The workshop roof had been patched so well that Ethan had walked up and checked it himself and found work that was cleaner than anything he'd have done on his own. The yard looked different, not dramatically. Nothing had been renovated or transformed. The accumulated small neglect of 12 years of one man, maintaining a property by himself, managing everything alone, prioritizing what had to get done over what should get done, all of that had been quietly addressed. The difference between a place that was functional and a place that was cared for was more visible than Ethan had expected. Ethan looked at it all for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "You know what today was, don't you?" It wasn't a question. Exactly. Ethan looked at him. "Tell me what you think it was." Glenn put his hands in his pocket. "It was the first time in 12 years somebody showed up for you." He paused. Really showed up. Not dropped by for coffee. Not called to ask about the truck. Up. He turned to look at Ethan directly. "How does that feel?" Ethan was quiet for long enough that the question hung in the air between them with real weight. He said finally, "But not bad strange." "Not bad strange," Glenn repeated. Almost smiled. "That's the most Ethan Caldwell sentence I've ever heard in my life." Ethan went inside. Made 2 more coffees. They sat on the porch in the early evening, the way they had 100 times before, and didn't talk much because they didn't need to. The day had been so full that silence felt appropriate. After a long piece of music that you're not quite ready to leave yet, left just before dark. He stopped at his truck, stared back. "Ethan." "Yeah." "Don't disappear on them," Glenn said. "Whatever this is, whatever comes next, don't do what you always do." Ethan frowned slightly. "What do I always do?" "You help," Glenn said. "And then you step back so far nobody can find you." He looked at his old friend steadily. "Didn't do that this time." He got in the truck and drove away. Ethan stood on the porch and watched the taillights go and thought about that for a long time. About it the next morning. Over coffee, he thought about it while he worked Monday, bringing the usual rhythm of the shop, customers, engines, the familiar language of mechanical problems and their solutions. About it Tuesday afternoon, when a woman came in with a Honda that had been overheating, and he found the problem in 11 minutes and fixed it in 40, and she said thank you 3 times and meant it. And he said, "You're welcome" once, and meant that too. And she drove away and the lot was empty again, and the quiet settled back in the way it always did. He was thinking about it Wednesday morning when his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. He'd made a habit over the years of not answering unknown numbers, as unknown numbers were usually either robocalls or bad news, and he had enough of both without going looking for more. "Honors," he answered, "Mr. Caldwell." A woman's voice. Clear, terracotta, direct, carrying the particular quality of someone who was accustomed to being in pain and had decided not to let it be the loudest thing in the room. "This is Claire Whitmore." Ethan's hand tightened slightly on the phone. He sat down on the stool by the workbench. Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "How are you feeling?" "Better than I was," she said. "Worse than I'm going to be." A pause. "Jackson told me you'd probably say something like that first." "Something like what?" "He said you'd ask about me before anything else. That was the first thing you did, every time, asked how I was doing." Her voice shifted slightly. Not softer, exactly, but more careful, the way voices get when they're approaching something they've thought about for a long time. He was right. Ethan said nothing. Let her take whatever time she needed. "I've been trying to figure out what to say to you for 2 weeks, Claire said. "I'm not someone who has trouble with words. Ask my husband. Ask anyone who knows me. They'll tell you I always know what to say." A brief pause. "I don't know what to say to you." "You don't have to say anything," Ethan said. "I know I don't have to," she said. "That's not why I'm calling." Another pause. Shorter. "I'm calling because I need you to know that I remember. I need you to know that it wasn't just someone pulling me out of a ditch. I was somewhere very far away, Mr. Caldwell. I was somewhere I wasn't sure I was going to come back from. Your voice was the thing that told me there was still somewhere to come back to." Ethan looked at the workbench, at the tools hanging on their hooks, the parts laid out in their trays, ordinary solid reality of the shop around him. "Tell me about a transmission job," Claire said. And there was a sound in her voice that was almost a laugh and almost something else. Told me your customer was coming at 8 and you needed to sleep. I needed to make it through the night. I remember, Ethan said quietly. That was the most useful thing anyone has ever said to me, Claire said. Because it was so specific, so ordinary. It wasn't you're going to be okay or hang on. It was a transmission job at 8 in the morning. My brain held on to that like it was a handhold on a cliff. She stopped. You gave me something concrete to make it to. Do you understand what I mean? I think so, Ethan said. Most people, when they're trying to comfort someone, let's say big things, Claire said, big reassuring things. And sometimes that's right. But what I didn't know I needed was something small and real and completely ordinary. And that told me the world was still out there, running on schedule, still expecting things from people. Her voice steadied. Claire, you gave me that. Ethan sat with that for a moment. About that night, about the choice he'd made from it to just talk, not to offer reassurance or comfort in any formal sense. The way he would have talked to himself, the way he'd been talking to himself for years, about the job at 8, the customer, about needing sleep. He hadn't thought of it as strategy, of it as staying sane. Mrs. Whitmore, he said. Claire, she said. Claire. He said, I'm glad you're here to tell me that. A silence. Oh, but not uncomfortable. Jackson said you wouldn't take anything, she said. I told him no. He said you agreed to let him carry the debt. He needed to, Ethan said. Understood that. He told me what he said to you. You being family. Her voice was careful now. Testing something. What did you think of that? Ethan considered it honestly. He'd been turning it over since Saturday. I thought it was a big thing to say, he said. From that. And he said it again anyway, Claire said. Isn't a question. He did. He means it, she said. I want you to know that. Jackson does not say things he doesn't mean. One of his best qualities, and occasionally his most inconvenient one, the almost law again, this time, when he says your family, telling you that the door is open, permanently, without conditions. Ethan absorbed that. That's a generous thing. It's an accurate thing, Claire said. Generosity implies we're giving you something that costs us. It doesn't feel that way. It feels like recognizing what's already true. A pause. Makes sense? It does, Ethan said. And it did in the way things make sense when you hear them said correctly for the first time after a long time of feeling them without the words. Time to meet you, Claire said. When I'm on my feet, Jackson says, you won't refuse me the way you refused the meeting. He told you that? He told me everything, she said. A man who keeps things from me. Another of his best qualities. Her voice was getting slightly tired, not in spirit, but in the physical way of someone whose body was still in recovery and working against the will. Come to you, if that's all right. I'd like to see the road. I'd like to see where it happened, and I'd like to meet you on the ground you were standing on when you made that choice. Ethan thought about Route 89, darkness, and the tire marks, and the spinning wheel. Hard stretch of road, he said. I know, Claire said. That's why I want to go back to it. A pause that had something definitive in it. The things that nearly break you, you go back to them. You stand on that ground, and you don't let it be only the place where the bad thing happened. You make it be something else too. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Your husband said you were the best person he'd ever met. He's biased. Maybe, Ethan said. I'm starting to think he's also right. She laughed. Well, one this time, brief and warm. Mr. Caldwell, Ethan, he said. All of it, she said. Thank you. For all it, for stopping, not leaving, for talking about the transmission job. Her voice quieted. Just staying until I was safe. You're welcome, he said. Nurse. And then, because it was true and because she deserved to hear it, I stopped too. Every day I've known you were all right. I've been glad. Get some sleep tonight, she said. No customer at 8 tomorrow, he said. So I might actually manage it. She laughed again. Bye. The call ended. Ethan set the phone down on the workbench in the quiet of the shop for a while. Just sat, not thinking particularly hard about anything, not analyzing what had just happened or what it meant or where it was going. Just letting it exist. The call, her voice, the thing she'd told him about the handhold on the cliff. Oh, He'd given her something concrete to hold on to. She'd just done the same thing for him, knowing it. 3 weeks passed. They were different weeks from the ones before them. On the surface, nothing had changed. He still opened the shop at 7:30. Earl fixed what needed fixing. Still swept the floor at 5 and locked up at 5:30. Still drove home through the desert with the windows down. It was different now. It had texture to it that it hadn't had before. Card in his shirt pocket, he'd moved it to his wallet. It's the inside pocket where he kept things he didn't want to lose, had a weight to it that he was aware of. Oppressively, just present, like a key to something he didn't know the full shape of yet. Glenn came by twice that week. Both times he looked at Ethan with an evaluating eye. The way a person looks at someone they've known a long time and are checking for changes they can't quite name. Others. You seem different, Glenn said on the second visit. How? Glenn thought about it. Less closed up, he said finally. A window that's been opened. Ethan considered that. Claire Whitmore called me, he said. Glenn's eyebrows went up. Well, Ethan told him. Not everything, but enough. And Glenn listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Glenn and indicated that he understood the seriousness of what he was hearing. Sir, she said you gave her something to hold on to, Glenn said when Ethan finished. About a transmission job. At 8 in the morning. There. Glenn was quiet. Then he shook his head slowly. Not in disbelief, but in the particular way of a man encountering something that is both completely surprising and completely characteristic at the same time. Of course you did, he said softly. Of course that's what you said. Ethan looked at him. Mean. It means, Glenn said, that you have been talking to yourself out loud in that shop for 2 years because you thought nobody was listening. He paused. Turns out somebody was. Ethan went still. He hadn't thought of it that way. He'd been so focused on the practical, on what he'd done, what she'd needed, what had worked, that he hadn't stepped back far enough to see the full shape of it. But of talking to himself, which had developed from loneliness and necessity and the particular stubborn refusal to let the silence win that habit had been, felt him knowing it, the thing that reached her in the dark. The thing that had been born from 12 years of being alone had saved her life. Oh, what to do with that? He picked up his coffee mug and put it down again without drinking from it. Right? Glenn asked. Yeah, Ethan said. Just thinking about how things connect, Ethan said. Things you don't expect to connect. He didn't sleep much that night. Not from anxiety, not the bad kind. The churning, restless kind he'd had in the years right after Linda. It was different. This was the wakefulness that comes when your mind is moving through something important and isn't quite done yet. Turning it over, examining its different faces, trying to understand what it's actually made of. About Linda. He thought about the years after, about the slow, quiet way he'd constructed a life that was functional and honest, and without much room in it for the things that could hurt you if you let them. Connection, expectation, the complicated business of mattering to someone and having them matter to you. About what it had cost him. Not in any dramatic way. He hadn't been miserable. He'd been fine. He'd been working and useful and capable. Himself, and he'd told himself that was enough, and mostly he'd believed it. But there was a difference between enough and full. And for the first time in a long time, he was feeling that difference clearly. A week after the Saturday visit, the phone rang again. There this time, Derek Holt. Mr. Caldwell, Derek said. And there was something in his voice that was something different from the first time he'd called. There's less formal, less managed. Jackson wanted me to let you know Claire's been cleared for travel. I'm going to come out next weekend if that works for you. It works, Ethan said. She's doing well, Derek added, and then seemed slightly surprised at himself for having volunteered that. Ethan said. Tell her not to push it on the road. A brief pause. I'll pass that along, Derek said. He sounded like he was almost smiling. He'll ignore it, but I'll pass it along. The weekend arrived with the kind of weather that Arizona produced in the late fall, clear and cold in the morning. By afternoon, the light having that particular quality of the season that made everything look slightly more defined than usual. Edges sharper, colors richer, they arrived mid-morning. 400 this time. A smaller group, maybe 20 riders. More personal, the sound of them coming down the roads still sent a low vibration through the ground. The podcast was a different sound from the first time. Familiar now, in a way that surprised Ethan when he recognized it. The porch when they turned in. He'd made coffee enough for a crowd as he'd learned something on that first Saturday about the relationship between preparation and being a decent host. And Claire Whitmore was on the back of Jackson's bike. Ethan watched her get off carefully. She moved with the deliberate precision of someone managing a body that was still in negotiation between what had happened to it and what it intended to do next. She wore the same kind of dark riding clothes, a different jacket, and she moved without assistance, though Jackson stayed close in the way of a person who would catch without making a show of being ready to catch. She stood up straight, looked at the property, then looked at Ethan on the porch. She was not what he'd expected, though he hadn't exactly known what he'd expected. Around 50, strong face, dark eyes that were quick and direct and missed nothing. A face that had been through things and had decided those things didn't get to win. She walked to the porch. She stopped at the bottom of the steps, the same place Jackson had stopped on that first morning. There's 3 porch steps between her and Ethan, and looked up at him. "Taller than I thought you'd be," she said. "I'm 5'11". "I know. I just had an image." She tilted her head slightly. "You were a voice in the dark for 2 weeks before you were a person." "It takes some adjustment." "I understand that," Ethan said. "I'm the steps." She extended her hand, and he took it, and her grip was firm and deliberate, and said something about her that words weren't needed for. "Caldwell," she said. "Claire Whitmore," he said. They looked at each other for a moment, the way people look at each other when they've already shared something enormous and are now meeting for the first time. Is one of the stranger and more significant experiences a person can have. "I heard you talked about a transmission job," she said. "In the morning," he said. "Customer was counting on me." She looked at him steadily. "I thought about when I was coming out of the anesthesia after surgery, and everything was still blurry, and I wasn't sure where I was." "What?" "Whether the transmission got fixed," she said. "I genuinely wanted to know." Ethan stared at her for exactly 1 second. Then he laughed, a real laugh, a full one, the kind that comes from somewhere unexpected and genuine. Whitmore laughed too, and the sound of both of them laughing on that porch brought Jackson's head around from across the lot where he'd been talking to Derek. On Jackson Whitmore's face in that moment, relief and warmth, and something that was very close to joy was something Ethan would remember for the rest of his life. "Did it?" Claire asked when the laughter settled. "The transmission." "It did," Ethan said. "Customer was happy, back in an hour." "Good," she said. Complete sincerity. That matters. They sat on the porch, 3 of them, Ethan, Claire, and Jackson, while the 20 riders spread out around the property with a natural, easy familiarity, some helping where help was visible, some just present in the way that people are present when they belong somewhere. Conversation moved the way good conversations move, not in a line, but in a kind of widening circle, each loop covering more ground than the last. They talked about the accident directly, Claire describing what she remembered from her side of it, which wasn't much. Just fragments, but the fragments she had were specific, and she delivered them without drama. In fact, quality of someone who had already made a kind of peace with what had happened and was now just narrating a fact. She said she remembered the smell of motor oil. She said she remembered a voice that was not afraid. She said she remembered the specific cadence of it, not the words themselves. The rhythm, steady and unhurried, like someone doing something they knew how to do. She said she held on to that rhythm the way you hold on to a rope in deep water. Ethan listened and let her tell it. He didn't interrupt or redirect. He just listened because she'd needed to say it and he'd needed to hear it. Of those things could be true at the same time. Conversation moved to other things. To Jackson's account of the 3-day search for Ethan, which Claire found funnier than Jackson did, and Jackson's expression as she laughed at specific details told Ethan everything about the dynamic between them. A particular balance of 2 strong people who had been through enough together to have found their actual rhythm. And his appearance that first Saturday, which Ethan described briefly, which made Claire say she'd like to meet him, to the fence and the roof and the brake pads, led to a conversation about trucks generally, and led Ethan and Jackson, somewhat to the surprise of both of them, into a 15-minute discussion about suspension systems on older vehicles that Derek Holt observed from the yard, with the expression of a man who had not expected the afternoon to go in this particular direction. At some point, Claire looked at Ethan with the direct, evaluating look that he was already learning to recognize as characteristic. "What about Linda?" she said. It was the kind of question that could have landed wrong. Too personal. Too soon, too much, but it didn't land wrong. Something about the way she asked it made it feel like the natural next thing. Conversation had arrived at that point, the way water arrives at lower ground. Ethan looked out at the desert for a moment. She was the one who kept the yard full, he said. Always people around. She liked people. Was good with them better than me. She could find the right thing to say in situations where I'd just stand there. What would she say about today? Claire asked. About it. Really thought not the automatic response he usually gave when people asked him hypotheticals about Linda. She'd say I waited long enough, he said. And she'd probably say she was glad I finally opened the door. A pause. And then she'd ask if there was enough coffee. Claire smiled. Made a full pot, Ethan said. Smart man, she said. Toward the end of the afternoon, when the light had gone that long amber color and the air had the first serious bite of evening to it, I asked to walk to the back fence. Just her and Ethan. Jackson watched them go, with an expression that was entirely trusting, entirely at peace, the expression of a man who had no anxiety about the people he loved moving through the world because he knew them and trusted them, and that was enough. The fence, the rebuilt fence, the posts Ethan and Brecky had set together 3 weeks ago, split in the ground now, properly aligned. Claire put her hand on a post, tested it, nodded once, the small nod of someone approving of work done correctly. Tell you something, she said. Go ahead, Ethan said. It happened. I wasn't supposed to be on that road. She looked at the desert beyond the fence, at him. I had a fight with Jackson, not a serious one. We don't have serious fights. We've moved past that, but the kind where you need air. Where you need to move. She paused. I took the bike out to clear my head. Didn't tell anyone where I was going. Ethan said nothing. If I'd told him where I was going, Claire said he'd have sent people with me and been annoyed, and they'd have been there. And have gone down alone on Route 89 at 11 at night. Her hand stayed on the fence post. Also wouldn't have met you. And I don't know how to feel about that trade. You don't have to feel any particular way about it, Ethan said. Oh, she said. But I think about it. She turned to look at him finally. Think about the specific chain of things, the argument, the road, curve, darkness, and then your headlights. And I think about how many points in that chain had to line up exactly right for me to be standing here talking to you. A lot of them, Ethan said. She agreed. And the one I keep coming back to, she paused, is you, the fact that you stopped. Someone would have stopped eventually, Ethan said. Maybe, she said. But you stopped when it mattered. She held his gaze. Whole thing, Ethan. That's all of it. You stopped when it mattered. He looked at this woman, this stubborn, clear-eyed woman, who had held on to the sound of his voice like a rope in deep water and pulled herself back and felt clarity that surprised him, that Glenn had been right. Those some doors you don't close. This one had been opening since the moment he'd seen the tire marks on Route 89, and he'd been standing in it without fully knowing it. He was standing in it fully, with the cold evening air of the desert around him, and a rebuilt fence under his hand, and the sound of 20 motorcycles and voices carrying from the yard behind them. It wasn't alone in this yard. He hadn't been alone in this yard for a while now. A strange, unfamiliar, not bad strange feeling that brought with it was something he decided. Standing there at the back fence with Claire Whitmore in the amber light, he was going to stop treating like something temporary. Ready to go back in? He said. Coffee's going to get cold. Claire looked at him with the slight smile of someone who recognizes a deflection but chooses to accept it, because the deflection is itself an answer. Lead the way, she said. Back across the yard, together, toward the light and the voices, and the sound of Jackson Derrick arguing amiably about something that involved pointing at the truck, Glenn's pickup, in the lot he'd arrived an hour ago. Invited and entirely expected, and the porch with its light on, and the coffee getting cold, and all the ordinary, concrete, completely specific details of a life that was no longer only his. And left that evening with a handshake for Jackson. Promised to Claire that he'd bring his famous chili next time anybody showed up at Ethan's property in force. A look at Ethan over his shoulder as he climbed into his truck that said everything the two of them had never needed words for. Ethan watched Ted's taillights and felt something he hadn't felt at the end of a day in a long time, not relief that the quiet was returning, a kind of pleasant heaviness, the specific tiredness of a day that had been genuinely full. Jackson and Claire stayed one more hour after the riders left. Three of them sat in the kitchen, the same table where Jackson had held his coffee with both hands that first morning. The whole thing had really started, and talked with the ease of people who had skipped several of the usual stages of getting to know each other and arrived somewhere further along than any of them had quite planned for. But at one point, Jackson looked around the kitchen slowly, taking it in, and said, "You need more chairs." Ethan looked at the 2 chairs that weren't occupied. "We have 4 chairs. You need more than 4, Jackson said. Ethan opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Claire. She raised her eyebrows in a way that clearly communicated this was not her argument to have. Looked back at Jackson. "That's a thing you plan ahead for," Ethan said. "Having more chairs." "Yes," Jackson said, meeting his eyes evenly. "I'll look into it," Ethan said. Jackson nodded, satisfied, and picked up his coffee. Left close to 8. Claire hugged him at the door. It was brief and firm. A performance in it, the hug of someone who didn't dispense them casually and meant this one specifically. Jackson shook his hand, and the handshake lasted a moment longer than a standard one, the way handshakes do when the people involved are communicating something beyond the gesture. "Same time next month?" Jackson said. Ethan thought about 400 motorcycles on his gravel road. "Maybe half that many riders," he said. 20, Jackson said immediately. "It is fine," Ethan said. "Done." He stood on the porch and watched their taillight disappear into the desert dark. Stayed there for a while after they were gone, the way he'd stood on that porch 1,000 times before, alone with the quiet and the stars, the specific quality of desert night air that had been the backdrop of his life for 30 years. It was the same porch, same stars, same air. He was not the same man who'd stood here 3 weeks ago. Inside, washed the mugs, put them on the rack. At the kitchen, 4 chairs, 1 table, the card from Jackson still in his wallet, from the hospital parking lot still in his glove box, memory of Claire's voice on the phone still sitting in him somewhere, warm and permanent. He went to bed. He slept the whole night through. The next morning, he got up at 6, coffee, on the porch. He watched the desert go from dark to orange to full morning light. Oh, we're back in the brush. The air was colded enough that he could see his breath for the first few minutes. He wrapped both hands around the mug the way Jackson had done that first morning and thought about how strange it was that a gesture could remind you of a person, about what it meant to be family to someone. Family he understood, that kind well enough, had been without it for long enough that he'd stopped waiting for it to show up. Their kind. The kind that gets built from the specific combination of proximity and crisis and the choice over and over to not look away when it would have been easier to. He'd made that choice on Route 89 because it was the only choice his conscience would allow. He hadn't made it for any of this, and yet here it was anyway. All of it. The rebuilt fence and the new brake pads and the card in his wallet and Claire's laughter on his porch and Jackson at his kitchen table and 20 riders next month. And Glenn with his chili in a world that had no announcement or fanfare or anything he'd asked for, quietly filled back up. He was still sitting with that when his phone rang at 7:15. At the screen, "Derek Holt," he answered. "Little early," he said. "Oh, sorry." Derek's voice had something in it that made Ethan straighten slightly. Like, Derek Holt, he'd come to understand, was not a man who panicked, but something compressed and deliberate that indicated the call had a specific purpose. Of a situation. What kind of situation? The two men who left Claire on the road, Derek said, out about last Saturday. About you. About what Jackson did coming to your property, ceremony, telling the chapter your family. A pause, precisely calibrated. They're saying it's a weakness. Jackson went soft over his wife and let a civilian into the inner circle, and that it compromises the organization. Ethan was quiet. They're not just saying it quietly, Derek continued, talking to people, other chapters, trying to build a case that Jackson's judgment is impaired. Another pause. This is internal. It doesn't involve you directly. Jackson wanted you to know because it does involve me, Ethan said. Yes, Ethan stood up from the porch chair, walked to the railing. At the road. These two men, he said. Who are they? I can't give you names, Derek said. I'm not asking for names so I can do something with them, Ethan said evenly. I'm asking because I want to understand what I'm looking at. A beat of silence. Then they've been with the chapter for a long time. Enough to have relationships across multiple chapters. Enough that the challenge they're mounting isn't coming from nowhere. And Jackson knows all this. Jackson has known since Tuesday. He asked me to call you today because Derek stopped. Heard again. He said you deserved to know that the thing you walked into might have edges you didn't see coming. Ethan took a breath of cold morning air. Slowly. Here was the thing about what Derek was telling him. And underneath the thing, two men who had left Claire on a mountain road and gone to bed were now threatened, not by punishment, as Jackson had told Ethan that was being handled, and Ethan trusted that, but by what Ethan's existence in their world represented. His presence, the fact of it, the gesture Jackson had made on that Saturday morning, was a living daily reminder of what they had failed to be. Every time anyone talked about Ethan Caldwell, the man who stopped, the man who stayed, the man who talked about transmission jobs in the dark, it was, implicitly, a conversation about what they had not done. He understood it. He didn't like it, but he understood it. What Jackson needs, Ethan said. Derek paused. You called me to tell me this for a reason, Ethan said. You're warning me, or Jackson needs something. So tell me what he needs. Another pause. Then Derek said, with the quality of a man who had been surprised and was recalibrating, he doesn't need anything from you. He wanted you to know so you weren't caught off guard if something reached you. Something like what? People talk, Derek said. Channels. Some of these men have long memories and wide contacts. Jackson doesn't think anything would come directly to you, but he's not a man who leaves people uninformed. I appreciate that, Ethan said. He was thinking. Moving through it, the way he moved through a mechanical problem, not with emotion, with the particular focused practicality that had served him well for 58 years. Can I ask you something, Derek? Go ahead. Do you think Jackson's judgment is impaired? A silence, but complete. No, Derek said. Do you think bringing me into this circle was a mistake? Another short silence. No. Then I'd say he doesn't have a problem with his judgment, Ethan said. A problem with two men who don't want to be accountable for what they did. And those are different problems. Derek was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had a different quality to it. Something that had been at professional remove was closer now. They're direct. That's exactly what Jackson said, almost word for word. Then he doesn't need my help, Ethan said. He needs people around him who already see it clearly, which it sounds like he has. He does, Derek said. Of them. That's why he wanted you to know. Ethan went back to his coffee. And kind of cold, it had gone slightly cold while he'd been standing at the railing. He drank it anyway. Tell him I'm not worried, he said. The 20 riders next month is still good. He heard something that might have been a laugh, oppressed. I'll tell him, Derek said. The call ended. Ethan sat back down in the porch chair, looked at the road, about what had just shifted. He'd spent his life at the edges of things. Not the center of anything, not anyone's first call, a person anyone depended on in any kind of ongoing way. Unreliable and present and useful, but on his own terms, in his own small orbit, affecting the people who came to him and nobody else. Now he was in the middle of something that had edges he couldn't see from where he was standing. He was connected genuinely, consequentially connected to a world that had its own physics, own codes, its own internal pressures, and that connection had been made not because he'd sought it or planned for it, but because one night he'd stopped his truck on Route 89 and refused to drive past. He'd have to be a fool not to understand the weight of that. A fool, he also was not, he realized, afraid. That was the thing that surprised him most. Sitting on his porch in the cold morning with slightly cold coffee, alone for 12 years, and he'd been fine, genuinely fine, performing fine, and he knew how to handle solitude and silence and the absence of the things that most people needed around them. He'd built himself a life that worked. It was a narrow life, honest about its narrowness, but it worked. And now this wide, complicated, layered thing was sitting in the middle of it, and he wasn't afraid of it. He was curious about it. That was new. That was different from anything he'd felt in a long time. Curiosity about what came next, not dread, not resignation, performance of someone going through motions. Actual, alive, genuine curiosity. Linda would have had something to say about that. He smiled into his cold coffee. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon that had given him nothing more dramatic than a carburetor rebuild and a customer who'd talked his ear off for 40 minutes about his grandson's baseball team, Ethan's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. Well, he almost didn't answer. Barrett learned slowly, over the past month, to answer more unknown numbers than he used to. The world had gotten larger than it had been. Larger worlds had more unknown numbers in them. Caldwell, a man's voice, older, slightly rough, with the particular texture of someone who had smoked for years and quit and carried the evidence of both. Speaking, Ethan said, "My name is Raymond Briggs. I ride with the chapter out of New Mexico." A pause. "I heard about what happened. What you did for Claire Whitmore, and what Jackson did after." Ethan waited. He had the feeling this call was one of the edges Derek had told him about, something reaching him through the wide network of connections he hadn't known. He was touching when he'd carried a woman up an embankment in the dark. "Tell you directly," Raymond Briggs said. "A man, without going through channels." Another pause. "There are people in this organization who are saying Jackson made a mistake. That bringing you in the way he did was sentimental and impractical." "I've heard that," Ethan said. A beat of silence. "I'm not one of those people," Raymond said. "Because I am one of those people they're trying to recruit. I want you to know that I'm not joining them." His voice had a steadiness to it that Ethan recognized, the steadiness of someone who'd thought about something for a long time and arrived at a conclusion they were at peace with. "I've been in this life for 38 years. I've seen a lot of things done in the name of strength that were really just fear with better clothes on. I've seen a few things done from genuine character that people called weakness." He paused. "What Jackson did wasn't weakness, and what you did on that road wasn't small. I wanted you to hear that from someone you've never met." Ethan sat down on the stool by the workbench. "Does it matter to you that I hear it?" he asked honestly. "Because you didn't do it for anything," Raymond said. "You did it for nothing. You saved a life and walked away and didn't want a single thing in return. And in my experience, the people who do things like that, they sometimes don't know what that means. They think it was ordinary. They think it was just what anyone would do." A pause that had something deliberate in it. "I'm calling to tell you that it wasn't. I'm calling to tell you that I've been riding for 38 years, and I've known hundreds of men, and what you did is not ordinary. It is specifically and genuinely extraordinary. And you should know that." Ethan was very quiet. "That's all," Raymond said. "It won't take up more of your time." "Raymond," Ethan said. The man could hang up. "Yeah. Thank you," Ethan said. "That means something." A brief pause. "Good," Raymond said. Supposed to. The call ended. Ethan sat on the stool for a long time after. About the phrase that Raymond Briggs had used, fear with better clothes on. He'd never heard it put exactly that way, but he recognized it immediately as true. with the specific recognition of a truth you've always known but never had the precise language for. About the two men who'd turned back on the mountain road and then tried to reframe their failure as a critique of Jackson's leadership. About how people did that took the thing they couldn't live up to and tried to make it the problem of the person who had. He'd seen it before, never at this scale, but the mechanism was the same. And Raymond Briggs, 38 years, a rough-edged voice, a man he'd never met and might never meet, had called him on a Tuesday afternoon to make sure he understood what he'd actually done. Put the phone in his pocket, stood up, got back to the carburetor. Something had settled in him more firmly than it had been before. A kind of standing ground, the specific feeling of knowing exactly where you are and choosing to stay there. Month moved forward. Glenn came by on Thursday with actual chili, not a promise of chili, actual chili in a large pot that he carried through the shop door with both hands and set on the workbench with the announcement that it was for the freezer in portions for the next time the yard filled up. Ethan looked at the pot and then at Glenn and didn't say anything, because some things didn't require anything said. Glenn stayed for dinner. They ate the chili at the kitchen table and talked about baseball and the weather forecast and Glenn's ongoing feud with a particular section of his backyard fence that refused to stay level no matter how many times he addressed it. Ordinary, complete, nourishing conversation. The kind that built up over years between people who decided to keep choosing each other. At the end of the meal, Glenn said, almost offhandedly, heard through Tom Briggs that there was some noise in the organization about Jackson and you. There was, Ethan said. Past tense? Seems like it's settling down. Ethan pushed his bowl slightly. How Jackson handled it. How? Ethan paused. I don't know the specific. And I'm not sure I need to. Glenn looked at him with the careful look of a man calibrating. All right with that? Not knowing? Ethan thought about it honestly. Their world, he said. I'm connected to it, but I'm not in it. There's a difference. Jax understands that difference. Do I? Glenn nodded slowly. That's a mature thing to say. I'm 58, Ethan said. I should manage at least one mature thing per conversation by now. Glenn snorted, drank the last of his coffee, looked at the kitchen, the 4 chairs, the clean mugs on the rack, the specific quality of a room that was in use more than it used to be. More chairs yet? Glenn said. Working on it, Ethan said. Brought the 20 riders on schedule. They came on a Saturday. Again, different riders from the first time. Mostly, though Brecky was there, which Ethan found he was genuinely glad about. They worked again because apparently that was the shape these visits took, not just social calls, but working visits, where people arrived with purpose and left having done something concrete and useful, which suited Ethan's sensibility perfectly. This time, Ethan worked alongside them differently. The first Saturday, he'd been accepting somewhat stiffly labor of people he didn't know. This time, he was working with people he'd begun to know, and the difference was everything. He knew that the man named Carver was the one to ask about electrical problems. He knew that a writer called Moss had done roof work professionally for 15 years and had strong opinions about flashing that he would share at length if given the opening. That Brecky's silences were not unfriendly. They were just the natural state of a man who said exactly what needed to be said and nothing else. And in that respect, Brecky was someone Ethan understood at a fundamental level. There came this time. Not writing, she arrived in a truck with Derek, apparently graduated, somewhere in the past weeks, from Jackson's operational right hand to something that looked more like the group's general logistics coordinator, and also unspoken capacity to a person who checked on Ethan periodically in ways that didn't always have an obvious reason attached. She walked into the shop while Ethan was in the middle of something and sat on the stool the way Glenn sat on the stool without asking ceremony, like she'd been doing it for years. She watched him work for a few minutes in silence. Then she said, Raymond Briggs called you. Ethan glanced up. Did you? He told Jackson. Jackson told me. She paused. Hope that was all right. Of course it was all right. He's a good man, Claire said. Raymond, he's been around long enough to see through most things. Someone directly, it's because he decided it mattered. He said what he needed to say, Ethan said. Help. Ethan set down the tool he'd been holding. About it. Yeah, he said, it helped. He looked at her. Because you're the kind of person who helps everyone else figure out what's real, Claire said. I wasn't sure who did that for you. He looked at her for a moment. Hun, he said. Glenn can't be your whole list, she said. It's a short list, he agreed. Getting longer. She smiled at that. Almost smile, not the warmth, with restraint smile she defaulted to when she was being careful. Unguarded one. Good, she said. That's the idea. Jackson arrived an hour after Claire, having ridden rather than driving, on his face when he came through the shop door and found his wife on the stool and Ethan working, and the two of them in the middle of what was clearly already an ongoing conversation. That look was so completely undefended, openly, privately happy, that Ethan had to look back at his work for a moment to give the man some dignity. Without me, Jackson said to Claire. You took the scenic route, she said. Always take the scenic route. I know, she said. I didn't wait. Jackson looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Jackson. A brief, mutual, entirely male acknowledgement of the fact that some people make the rooms they walk into better just by being in them. And they were both lucky enough to know one of those people. Ethan said. Please, Jackson said. They worked through the afternoon, and at 8 in the evening, the chili, which Glenn had dropped off in portioned containers the previous Tuesday, with the satisfied air of a man completing a mission, and sat on the porch afterward while the desert went through its colors. There Ethan, Jackson, Claire, Derek, Glenn, who'd appeared at 4 as if he'd known, Brecky, who declined the chili politely and then accepted a bowl and eaten it without commentary. 6 people on a porch that had held one for 12 years. Us. Ethan looked at it, actually looked at it, the way you look at something when you want to make sure you're seeing it correctly and not filling in what you expect to see. As people, real ones, present ones, people who would come back next month. He looked at his hands around the coffee mug and thought about Route 89, the tire marks in the headlights, about the 1 second, maybe 2, where his foot had hovered over the gas. It stopped because he was a hero. He hadn't stopped because he'd calculated what it might lead to, or what it might cost him, or what the return on the risk would be. He'd stopped because the alternative was driving past a person who needed help, and that was something he was constitutionally incapable of doing. That was the whole of it. But the thing he'd stopped for had turned out to be the thing that brought all of this. And the thing that had brought all of this, the full yard, rebuilt fence, the card in his wallet, the 6 people on the porch, had turned out to be the thing he hadn't known he needed and hadn't known how to ask for, and would not, as being completely honest with himself, have been able to find any other way. Jackson said something to Claire that Ethan didn't catch, something quiet and private, and she laughed and put her hand on his arm in the way that people touch each other when the gesture is so habitual it's almost unconscious, which meant it was the most real kind. Glenn and Brecky were arguing about something to do with fences. Glenn's ongoing theory that the angle of installation mattered more than depth, Brecky was dismantling with the methodical patience of a man who knew exactly what he was talking about. Had been on the phone for 20 minutes, putting a small track at the edge of the porch with the concentrated look of a man managing something that required his full attention. All of it was ordinary. Completely, specifically, irreplaceably ordinary. And Ethan sat in the middle of it and let it be real. After Jackson and Claire had gone, after Brecky and the others had ridden out, after Derek had finished his call and followed, Glenn sat with Ethan for the last half hour of the evening the way he always did, 2 of them with their coffees and the quiet that wasn't empty anymore, and looked at the road for a while. Then he said, "That I keep thinking about?" "What?" "That night on Route 89. Glenn turned his mug in his hands. You didn't have to stop. Nobody would have known. I'd have driven home and gone to bed and never thought about it again. He paused. But you did stop. And everything that came from, everything that's sitting on this porch right now, everything in your yard, everything in your wallet, all of it came from that one moment. Ethan didn't say anything. I've been trying to figure out what the lesson is, Glenn said. There's a moral or a point or a, thing to take away. And Ethan said, Glenn was quiet for a moment. I don't think it's about the reward, he said. I don't think the lesson is that if you do good things come back, because that's not always true, and we both know it. He turned to look at Ethan directly. I think the lesson is about what you were when nobody was watching. What you were when the only person who would have known what you did or didn't do was you. He paused. You were the same person in the dark that you are in the daylight. I think that's rare. I think that's genuinely rare. The desert was very quiet around them. Ethan thought about 12 years of the same person in the dark that he was in the daylight, about sweeping the shop floor at 5 whether anyone saw it or not, fixing things that could have been left a little longer, stopping on a mountain road at 11:47 at night because the alternative was not stopping. It was not something he could do. He thought about Linda saying it was his most charming flaw, the way he couldn't ask for help. He thought about her saying it with love and exasperation in equal measure. About the window that Glenn had said was open now, boss, and the chairs he was going to buy for the kitchen table, the month stretching ahead with 20 riders on the schedule, and Claire saying the list was getting longer and meaning it as good news. About Raymond Briggs on a Tuesday afternoon, a man he'd never met calling to make sure he understood what he'd done. About Claire's voice on the phone saying she'd held onto the rhythm of his words like a rope in deep water. About Jackson Whitmore at his kitchen table, the hands around a coffee mug, saying you are family with the flat certainty of a man stating the clearest fact he knows. About the 1 second on Route 89 where his foot had hovered over the gas. 1 second, maybe 2, the whole shape of the rest of his life had been made in that second. Sure. I'm going to buy more chairs this week, Ethan said. And blinked, looked at him. That's what you're thinking about right now? 4 isn't enough, Ethan said. Jackson said so. Glenn stared at him for a moment longer. He laughed the real kind, the kind that came from deep enough to mean something, and shook his head and looked back out at the road. And Ethan laughed too, proud of it, went out into the desert night and disappeared into all that clean, dark space where sounds go when nobody is left to hear them. Church light was still on. It was always on. Ethan had left it on every night for 12 years habit, originally, then ritual, then something he stopped thinking about consciously. Just a small, constant thing he did, a light that said someone was here and lived here. Come if you need to. He'd never thought of it that way. He'd never thought of it as an invitation or a signal or anything more than a porch light. Looking at it now, with everything that had happened and everything that was still unfolding, maybe it had always been exactly that. A light that said, come if you need to. And eventually, because the world is stranger and more generous than a quiet man living alone in the desert has reason to believe, someone had not just someone, everything. Glenn finished his coffee, set the mug down, clapped Ethan once on the shoulder, the specific, careless, entirely sufficient gesture of a man who had been your person for 15 years and intended to keep being so. Then he got up, walked to his truck, started it, and drove slowly down the dark road toward his own lights. Boaters, Ethan stayed on the porch for a little while longer. About tomorrow. The shop at 7:30 never came through the door. The ordinary, good, honest work of a day. He thought about the card in his wallet and the 20 riders next month and the chairs he was going to buy. About the sound of 400 right fists against 400 chests in the morning desert. About Claire saying you stopped when it mattered and saying it like it was the whole thing. Well, it was all of it. It was all of it. That was the truth that Ethan Caldwell carried with him from that night forward, not as a lesson he'd learned from the outside, as something he'd always known from the inside and had now seen confirmed in a way too large and specific and real to misread or minimize. There's the truth that a single ordinary moment chosen correctly, nothing in it but the basic refusal to walk away from someone who needs you that moment, does not end. It just keeps going. It goes further than you can see from where you're standing. It pulls into the dark like a light left on for no one in particular, and eventually, quietly, or announcement, it finds its way home. Caldwell stood up from his chair, carried his mug inside, rinsed it on the rack beside the others, turned off the kitchen light to the door, and left the porch light on. He always left the porch light on. There. And now, for the first time in 12 years, he knew exactly why. Next morning came the way Arizona mornings always did without apology. Ceremony, just light arriving at its own pace and filling the world whether you were ready for it or not. He was ready. He was up at 6, coffee made, sitting in the porch chair with both hands around the mug, watching the sky go through its sequence of colors the way he had for 30 years. We're back. The air had that cold clarity that would be gone by 9 when the sun got serious about the day. Everything was where it had always been. But he noticed something this morning that he hadn't noticed in a long time. He was looking forward to the day, not bracing for it, not simply accepting it as the next installment of a life that was functional and honest and adequate. Actually, genuinely looking forward to it, the shop, whatever came through the door, the phone that might ring, the road that might bring someone he knew or someone he didn't yet. He sat with that, feeling carefully, the way you sit with something fragile that you don't want to startle. It over, examined it, made sure it was real. And not just the residue of a good evening. It was real. He drank his coffee and let it be real. At 7:15, his phone buzzed. A text which was unusual. Most of the people in his life still preferred to call, which was one of the things he appreciated about them. He looked at the screen. It was from Claire. 3 words. Coffee. He stared at it for a moment. Then he typed back, cold now. Got distracted. Her response came in under 30 seconds. Or what? He looked at the road, at the desert beyond it, at the sky that was now fully committed to morning and didn't care who knew it. Thinking about the day, a pause, longer than the previous ones. Then good thoughts or bad thoughts? He typed good ones. Her response this time was immediate. Just 2 words, but they carried the full weight of everything she'd meant when she'd said the list was getting longer, when she'd sat on his stool without asking, when she'd asked about Linda with the ease of someone who understood that the dead don't require protection from being mentioned. About time. Ethan read it twice. Then he set the phone down on the porch railing and picked up his coffee mug and finished the last of it, cold as it was, and looked at the road. And for the first time in 12 years, he did not see a road that went somewhere without a road that came back. He was inside at 7:20, rinsing the mug when he heard tires on the gravel. He looked out the window. A car he didn't recognize, older model, up the kept New Mexico plates, pulled up to the shop lot and stopped. A man got out, older, maybe 65. The rough voice and the quit smoking quality he'd heard on the phone. But Raymond Briggs had driven 4 hours. Ethan went to the door. Raymond looked up when the door opened. He had the face of a man who had spent most of his life outdoors, than weather, making decisions that mattered. He looked at Ethan steadily, the way Ethan had learned to recognize as the look of a man who said exactly what he meant and nothing else. It was time, Raymond said simply. Meet in person. Ethan looked at him. He opened the door wider. Coffee's fresh, Ethan said. Come in. Raymond Briggs walked through the door of Ethan Caldwell's shop on a cold Arizona morning, and the 2 men, who had never met but had already told each other true things, sat down at the workbench with their coffee and began the ordinary, essential, irreplaceable work of becoming people who knew each other. Outside, the desert went on, doing what it always did, stretching wide and quiet in every direction, indifferent and magnificent, holding everything in it without judgment. The road ran through it the way roads run through deserts, straight for a long time, then curving where the land required it, then straight again. On that road, somewhere a woman was probably already arguing with her physical therapist about recovery timelines. Kitchen 4 hours north, a man with a gray beard and 31 years of wearing the same vest was probably already on the phone, already managing the 10,000 things that required managing, pausing only occasionally to glance at the chair across the table that had become, over the past weeks, the chair he thought of as Ethan's. House 4 miles down the road, a retired mail carrier was reheating coffee and already planning his next unannounced visit. Some habits once started have no good reason to stop. And in a small shop in the Arizona desert, a mechanic named Ethan Caldwell sat across from a man he'd never met until this morning, and listened, and let himself be known. He had stopped his truck on Route 89 because he could not drive past someone who needed him. He had not done it for any of this, but all of this had come from it: every chair, every voice, every early morning text, every rider over the hill, every cup of coffee shared across a table that used to seat one, and the sheer staggering weight of what a single honest moment could build. When the person making it was the same person in the dark that they were in the light, have overwhelmed him if he had tried to hold it all at once. He didn't hold it all at once. He just drank his coffee. He just sat across from Raymond Briggs and let the morning do what mornings do. On the kitchen counter, visible through the open doorway, between the shop and the house, there's 6 new chairs stood in a row where he'd stacked them after bringing them in from the truck the night before solid. Nothing fancy, exactly what they needed to be. There was room at the table now. Ethan Caldwell had made sure of it.